Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Elisia Cohen. I'm the director of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. I'm joined here today by Jane Kirtley, the Silha Professor of Media Ethics and Law and director of the Silha Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law based in the Hubbard School, which is funded by a generous endowment from the late Otto and Helen Silha. I'm also pleased to introduce Associate Professor Chris Ison, who has had a full career as a Pulitzer-winning investigative reporter for the Star Tribune before joining the school as a faculty member. We are fortunate to have their expertise as well as their experience as community members. Just want to pause for a moment. Sue, I just wanted to check on our technology to make sure that we're in speaker view. It appears that the host screen is up.
You should be in speaker view. You see something a little different than what the attendees do.
Great, thank you. I'm in speaker view. Great, so I want to begin by acknowledging first the grief and the pain in our Minneapolis and St. Paul community. We recognize that George Floyd will be memorialized here tomorrow, and many members of our community are grieving deeply. Many of the professional journalists in our community organizers, protesters, and other community members continue to work tirelessly to address issues of racism in our community. And the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, faculty and staff, take seriously our responsibility to educate the public on the roles and responsibilities of journalists and communication professionals. Recognizing this, we are able to host a panel today with our available faculty members. Today is simply the beginning of the conversation, and we expect that there will be many questions that will remain. This event is the first of what will be a series of webinar town hall events hosted by the school on this topic. Our plan today is to focus very closely on both legal rights and responsibilities of journalists, as well as the professional ethics involved in covering protests. Many of you listening in may not have ever taken a class in Murphy Hall or in a journalism school, and you might wonder, how do we prepare students to become professional journalists? What legal and ethical guidelines does the School of Journalism teach? Today, we are prepared to answer those questions and many others. Before I do, I want to also let you know that later this week on Friday, we'll have a co-sponsored panel with the Minnesota Public Relations Society of America chapter, involving local faculty and media relations professionals. And next week, we hope to bring you several other additional panels that will feature some of our community's finest journalists, photojournalists, and other general assignment reporters who will share their experiences covering live events. And our thoughts are with these brave storytellers who have been working tirelessly to give voice to the communities that they serve. As the moderator of this event, I need to go over a few logistics at the beginning of our conversation so that you know how to participate with us. First, this is a secure webinar that is being recorded. We plan to upload the recording to our website and our social media next week so that you may share it with others. Second, our panelists will talk each for about 30 minutes, answering questions that I have prepared for them in advance. We also do plan on answering your live questions that you might have for the panelists, and we'll answer those questions here live. You may ask those questions by typing them into the Q&A box. To find that box, I ask you to go down to the bottom of your screen. To the right, you will see just next to participants, the words Q&A. Click on it and type your question to the panelists. You can do so by your name or anonymously, whatever makes you feel most comfortable. You will note that there is no chat function available in the webinar, and that is because we want to focus on the questions that you have for Professors Kirtley and Ison. We'll answer as many of the questions that we can live, but if you have questions that remain, please feel free to send an email to Professors Ison and Kirtley. You might find their email addresses on our website. Last, at the end of the panel, I'm going to be asking you to complete a quick poll. I'll say more about that later. So let me first introduce Professor Jane Kirtley and set the context for today's conversation. Professor Kirtley holds an appointment in the University of Minnesota's Law School as well, and I thought that she could start by setting the scene for us a bit. Jane, we want to talk about the arrest of Oscar Jimenez. and the subsequent apology by the governor. And before we get there, we had a question that came to us from Steve Vakrat, an investigative reporter from the Kansas City Star that was quite detailed. We thought we could begin with. And that question is, what are journalists' rights in terms of being able to walk onto and view places that are public, say a park or a publicly owned town square, versus a place that's quasi-private, say a shopping center or entertainment district where vandalism has occurred or arrests are taking place when the police are attempting to restrict access. Jane?
Okay, thank you, Elisia, and good afternoon or good morning to everybody, whoever and wherever you may be. As Elisia said, I'm Jane Kirtley, and before I came to the University of Minnesota, I was the director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. So this is an issue I've been monitoring for many, many years, but I have to say that what we've seen in the last week, both here in Minneapolis and elsewhere, is truly without precedent. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the incidents that occurred here in Minneapolis, but we do have a list on the Silha Center website, and we'll be sharing that with you, I think, in the Q&A function, if you'd like to look at it for yourself. Let's start at the beginning. Everybody, I think, will say, oh, I must, as a journalist, have a First Amendment right to go anywhere I like and record anything I want. But that's not exactly what the First Amendment says. The Supreme Court has made clear that news gathering is, as they put it, not without First Amendment protection, but it's not unlimited. And as a general rule, journalists have to follow the same laws and regulations that apply to everybody else. So if you're a freelancer or just starting out, disabuse yourself of the idea that you can do anything you want. To a great extent, your role is truly that of any other citizen or any other attendee who's out there covering the news as a matter of First Amendment law. But having said that, there are some statutory protections. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I must make a disclaimer here that I am licensed to practice law only in New York, District of Columbia and Virginia, not Minnesota. So anything that I say here cannot be construed as legal advice. In any event, when we're dealing with things like protests that are occurring in a public place, journalists, just like anybody else, can film what is going on. Minnesota, for example, is a one-party consent state, which means that if you are a party to a recording, you may record what somebody else is saying, and there's no legal problem with that. There are some states that have stricter rules, but even they, after several recent decisions from various federal courts, have said that if you're doing things like recording police activity, you have a right to do that, regardless of what the other laws might say. This is all tied into the role that journalists are supposed to play as the watchdogs of the government and the eyes and ears of the public when things are happening. I happen to live about 7 blocks from where most of the worst events occurred over the last week or so. So this is something I'm really cognizant of because it was very important for me to see what journalists were reporting just in terms of my own property and my personal safety. This is a really valuable role that reporters play, but there are a couple of issues. One is that oftentimes law enforcement, in their desire to control what's happening at times of protests and civil disobedience, may be overzealous in their reaction. And this can range from something really as moderate as saying, move back, move out of the way, to actually threatening journalists and protesters with various kinds of weapons, tear gas, and so forth. Again, journalists are not going to be exempted from any of that. In our most recent experience, the only thing that journalists really had as a special exemption was they were not subject to the curfew that we had imposed here over the last week or so. The governor and other officials recognized that it was really important for journalists to be out basically 24/7 finding out what was going on. But of course, for others, like protesters and just citizens that were passing by, they would be subject to arrest and detention if they violated the curfew. But beyond that, we really don't have any special rights. So what does that mean in a practical sense? Well, one thing that happens is that journalists usually try to identify themselves as reporters so that law enforcement will understand, number one, the role they're playing, but number two, that they are not threatening to what is about to happen in case there actually is civil unrest. Nevertheless, as has been recounted in many media, in the last week or so, journalists here in Minnesota have been subject to a variety of situations. People have been using the term targeted, and I'm not sure that that's a term I would necessarily adopt in every case, but it is hard to escape the fact that it does appear that at least in some cases, the Minneapolis Police Department, the Minnesota State Patrol, and other law enforcement officials may, in fact, in their reaction to the fact that they basically didn't want the press there or didn't want them recording, that they were arrested, that their equipment was confiscated, and in some cases they were physically attacked with rubber bullets and tear gas. So this is a very serious situation. And some of you may have learned today that the American Civil Liberties Union has already filed a federal civil rights action on behalf of a variety of journalists against law enforcement here in the Twin Cities. They're basically seeking a restraining order, both a temporary and a permanent one, to stop law enforcement from targeting journalists in this way. We'll see how this plays out. But I guess my point is that however strong the laws may be, they have to be executed by people that are acting in good faith. One thing that's happened here that is a little bit different than I think we've experienced in the past is that the governor, Tim Walz, has come out at multiple press conferences reiterating how important the press is, how important their role is, and how essential it is that they be allowed to carry on their work. Now, to get back to the original question that was posed just very quickly, I'd like to say that again, if you're recording in a public place, as a general proposition, you are free to do that. That's perfectly legal. But what about quasi-public property or private property? Again, as a general rule, journalists have no greater right to be there than anybody else. So if a store owner says, I don't want you coming inside my store, he or she, as a general rule, would have the perfect right to say, no, you can't come in. In some circumstances, if that property were designated as a crime scene, it's possible that as a journalist, you'd be allowed to cross that line. But again, you have no greater rights than anybody else to go onto somebody's private property.
Thank you, Jane. Can Jane and Chris, maybe you can start with this one. Can you talk to the audience listening about why journalists and media organizations requested exemptions from curfew orders in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and elsewhere? And, you know, why is that issue of an exemption so important?
Well, these curfews are in difficult situation if they don't exempt the media. Obviously, the First Amendment allows us to gather information and be in public places and publish information. And it's hard to argue with the idea that these protests and police actions are some of the most important news we can get to the public, obviously, and we can't do it. Journalists can't do it unless they can be out there after curfew. So I think it was, I think here in Minneapolis at first, there was no exemption and they realized pretty quickly the error and it was called out to them and got amended. So journalists can be out there. Other states, and I believe it's the Reporters Committee, Jane, that is tracking this. A lot of other cities around the country don't have those exemptions. From what I've seen, they kind of ignore the fact that media is not exempt, and media is out there covering protests after curfew, as they should be allowed to do. Obviously, the problem is if there's not an exemption, it gives law enforcement a pretty easy reason to say you can't be here and arrest a journalist. So that could be a real problem. We've seen a lot of journalists roughed up. We've seen a fair number arrested and in most cases pretty quickly released. I don't know if they've been, because of the curfew necessarily. But it's clear that we have to be able to cover these things. In some of those states, I think they have also used this, the curfews don't include people who work in essential services, or there are going to work exemptions if you're going to work. And I think a lot of the news organizations have interpreted the law to those exemptions to include journalists so they can get out there and report. But obviously we have, people are glued to the TV sets, they're watching the news, they're on social media, they're watching to see if there are fires near where they live or where their businesses are. There's no more important time for journalists to be able to be given the freedom to cover things. This is public safety. It's an issue of how police are behaving. So I think it's pretty clear that media need to be exempt from those.
Thank you, Chris. Jane, as director of the Silha Center, you released a statement condemning the arrest of CNN's crew and have been tracking confrontations between reporters and the police. I'm going to share that with our attendees. Can you tell us what your center has been tracking on?
Well, you know, we started this after what happened Thursday into Friday last week. You know, the arrest and detention of Oscar Jimenez Marco Jimenez on camera, live camera, I think shocked everybody. And so it's kind of unusual for the Silha Center to issue statements, but this was one that we felt was a command performance. And part of the reason that this was so is that some of you may recall that during the Republican National Convention in 2008, which was held in St. Paul, there were multiple incidents between police, journalists, protesters. Some of them arose in the context of freelancers and independent journalists, but many of them were people that clearly had press credentials. Again, in this case, there was no question that this particular individual was clearly identified as a journalist. So it's hard to escape the notion that this was done knowingly and deliberately, that it wasn't just an accident where some individual who was indistinguishable from protesters got swept up in a mass arrest or something like that. Our tracking and the tracking of other groups as well has shown this story repeated over and over again around the country. And it is such a profound problem in terms of both the rights of the public to know and the right of the press to do the job that they need to do to keep the public informed. And sadly, after the Republican National Convention, when both the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul had to pay a very large settlement to Amy Goodman of Democracy Now!, they had pledged to train their law enforcement officials so that they would deal respectfully with journalists, not target journalists, not try to shut down journalists. It appears that that training may not have stuck, at least not in the current generation of law enforcement that we're dealing with today. So it seems to me that there's two things we need to do. We need to be documenting that this is not just an isolated occurrence. The ACLU, in the lawsuit that they filed today, is calling it a pattern and practice. That's legal jargon, basically, for saying this is what they have been doing for a long time. This is what they do routinely. And their challenge, based on the Federal Civil Rights Law, Section 1983, is that it violates the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, because it also involves the search and seizures of journalists' equipment and documentary materials. That's prohibited for the most part under the Federal Privacy Protection Act, but nevertheless, it's been happening. So I think what we're trying to do is both be a witness to this, document this, and hopefully at some point, and there's been some talk from the authorities, law enforcement authorities here, of trying to revise their guidelines and maybe sit down with journalists and their representatives here after things calm down a bit. And this is often a very good way to do this. Outside of a crisis, try to figure out where the flashpoints were, where the problems were, and to come up with ways to solve the problem. Journalists have jobs to do, law enforcement have jobs to do. Our goals are ultimately the same, I think, which is to get accurate information to the public about what's going on, as Chris Ison mentioned. That ought to be a common goal for all of us. And so the key is how to get that done in a way that does not undermine legitimate operations by law enforcement or legitimate operations by the press.
Thank you, Jane. Chris, you've been a reporter and a teacher here for decades. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what you're seeing from an ethical perspective? How does this look historically for journalists and journalistic coverage of protests in the Twin City? How does it compare to what you saw during the Republican National Convention? And what makes it different, do you think, or similar for reporters on the ground?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is a lot that is quite similar to, as Jane kind of referred to what has been going on for years. The Republican National Convention in 2008 is a great example because a lot of journalists were arrested there, I think around 40. And a lot of those journalists were just kind of swept up with other protesters. So it was a little different in that way, but in a lot of ways it was the same. They were arrested, detained, some of their equipment was taken, and it was slow to get it back. One difference there, though, is that there was actually quite a bit of planning and discussion with the media before the convention started, because they anticipated a lot of protests, of course, unlike this situation that kind of ignited pretty quickly. Despite that planning, a report that came out later after that, after the convention, showed that police really didn't have good protocols for what they were going to do with the media. Some law enforcement personnel, let media do their work and understood they were doing their work, and then some just arrested reporters like they arrested everybody else. Reporters got pepper sprayed, and it was pretty rough out there. After this report and a lot of criticism, St. Paul police, this happened in St. Paul, did get more training on how to handle the media during these kinds of events. But as we see, reporters keep getting arrested and are hit with violence from police, pushed down, pushed around, hit with rubber bullets and all that. So as Jane said, a lot of it doesn't seem to stick. And there have been a lot of other cases like this. Like the case on the highway the other night reminds me of the Philando Castile case in 2017. This was a case where a St. Anthony police officer was found not guilty after shooting Philando Castile. And during a protest after that, a lot of protesters gathered on I-94. And they were there for quite a while, and finally police decided they were going to disperse that crowd. And a couple of reporters, including one of our own at the U from the Minnesota Daily, were arrested. One of them was from City Pages, and she wrote about it later and was clearly trying to get away, trying to disperse and leave, and was caught and arrested, taken to jail, lost. It took a long time for her to get her equipment back. So it was very much like some of the cases we're seeing now, where reporters are giving ground, they're listening to police and trying to get away, and still being pursued and tackled and sometimes arrested. But there have been a lot of different cases. The Jamar Clark shooting in 2015 led to almost 3 weeks of an encampment outside the 4th Precinct in North Minneapolis. That was a difficult issue for journalists because it was night after night. It's got to be monitored every day and every night for 2.5 weeks there. And some of it was, there were skirmishes with police, but some of it also was very dangerous, and you didn't know where it was going to be coming from. Several protesters were shot by non-protesters, not police, just from agitators from the outside shooting into the crowd when people were there at the encampment. So one of the things they say, if you're a reporter covering this, you kind of got to have your head on a swivel, because the problems can come from any side. I remember as long ago as 2002, during a protest after a police shooting, a really emotionally charged protest, several reporters scrambled to the scene. One had their car completely destroyed, torched. Some others had their TV van badly damaged and roughed up. One reporter got hit with something and had a concussion. Two had to hide out at a convenience store. So in that case, you know, it was protesters. So it comes from all sides, and it depends on the situation. And what we know is reporters have to be prepared for anything from any direction. And they have to be careful and follow some precautions. And unfortunately, it also means that it has continued for decades. And this case would suggest that it hasn't gotten any better.
Thanks, Chris. I see that some questions are starting to come in, and so I encourage people to do so. And I'm going to skip a little bit around. First, I see that there's a question that's coming in that's similar to one that I wanted to ask Chris and Jane as well. That is, when you're training student journalists, how do you train them to cover protests when they're confronted by police? John Gillen asks, can you talk about best practices for journalist behavior and demeanor when confronted by police? As a long-time editor, he's had to deal with righteous reporters or photographers who've only made things worse.
Well, could I talk about it a little bit from the legal perspective to reiterate? Journalists as a legal matter have no greater rights than anybody else. I mean, we talked about the exception for journalists for the curfew. That's an exception. I think it was a good one. It's an excellent policy, and not universal, and you can't count on. So essentially, you have to assume that you are going to be subject to the laws as anybody else would be. Chris can talk about this too. We were discussing it yesterday in preparation for this panel. There's a new set of guidelines out from the Department of Public Safety that emphasizes that it's really important for journalists to wear credentials prominently, to identify themselves as journalists, that that's the way that law enforcement can be sure that they're treated properly. That sounds great in theory, but I think there are two issues with it. The obvious one is that sometimes journalists are, as Chris mentioned, targets for people that are either protesters or other agitators that happen to be on the scene. If they see that you're a journalist, they may be after you. They may want to smash your camera. They may want to attack you. So you have to kind of balance the issue of making yourself visible to law enforcement versus making yourself a target for other people. So there's that. I was watching some of the coverage over the last few days here, and I noticed that there were a number of journalists who were wearing all black clothing, which was really not different from what many of the protesters were wearing. Again, nothing wrong with being dressed like that, but you do have to ask yourself whether your role is to basically blend into the crowd, frankly, not give people notice that you're there, keeping a low profile. You know, is that what you want to do? That might make sense in certain contexts, but it does mean that you're going to be even more vulnerable to attack from law enforcement should they decide that they need to do some of the tactics that we saw in the last week here, like kettling, where you basically herd people almost like sheepdogs into a center area and hold them there. And if you're a reporter there, you know, with your cell phone, you know, I hope you've got your lawyer on speed dial, because otherwise you're going to be taken away with everybody else once people are taken into custody. I think being respectful to the police is kind of a given. They are armed, you are not. So it just makes sense to be deferential in that way. But having said all that, you're there to do a job, and without putting yourself at personal risk, clearly, or without unnecessarily agitating people that have all the force of law behind them. I think it is important for journalists to be resourceful in terms of trying to figure out how they're going to tell the story. And remembering too, that the protesters that are there, they're in a public place, they've chosen to be in a public place, but many of them may be very bothered by the notion that they're going to be captured on your camera, either still camera or a video camera, and maybe broadcast or published to the world. I think it's useful to be respectful of that. For example, you might decide that, I don't really need to focus on this little child that is accompanying somebody at the protest. The child, doesn't really have the legal capacity to consent to you capturing that image. And even though you probably have a legal right to do it, I think you have to balance the necessity of that versus the fact that there are competing rights that sometimes come into play here too. But I think the biggest point that I would make is certainly be persistent, certainly be polite, but also be aware that when it comes down to it, you're not armed. And I think as so many editors have said, and I'm sure Chris has said this too, you're no good to us if you're dead. I mean, you can't be reporting if you've been injured or if your equipment has been confiscated. And so you need to be cognizant of the fact that bottom line is you're making the record, but you probably shouldn't be the story.
Yeah, I'd agree. And space is important where you choose to be at what time. As Jane said, sometimes wearing credentials, if you want to be able to move about a crowd and not be targeted by protesters, for instance, maybe you don't want to necessarily have your credentials out. That doesn't mean you shouldn't identify yourself as a reporter when you're interviewing people. That you should do. But when police are around or nearby, you probably want to have your credentials out and make them very clear. And you kind of want to, obviously the principle, and this is used in a lot of different areas of journalism, is not to be the story. We don't want to be the story. We want to be able to report the story, and we can't do that if we are the story. So you want to take those kinds of precautions. There are a lot of good tip sheets through a lot of different media organizations. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has a good one. The Society of Professional Journalists, the Poynter Institute on best practices and safe practices when you're covering violent situations, specifically protests and things like that. I'll mention a few of them. A lot of it's common sense. But it goes out saying you can't be participating in criminal activity, and you should be clear that you're not participating in the protest. You're covering the protest. That's your job. So that kind of goes into this idea of a little distance. When things can escalate and there are police around, you'd rather be on the fringe. And you got to decide your right space. Is it closer to the protesters? Is it a little closer to the police? Is it halfway between, over on the edge? But you want to separate yourself, not just with your credentials, but kind of with your actions in your spot. A lot of training suggests that you should have at least one and maybe more than one escape route in mind. You want to be able to get out of there if police start closing in. If they tell you to get out, a lot of reporters get caught in a spot, and protesters where police tell them to disperse and there's not a good place to disperse to. There's a fence or there's some barricade they can't get over or something like that. It's really important as a reporter, if you don't want to get scooped up with everybody else, have a couple of escape routes. And if police ask you to move, you need to move away. Identify yourself as news media, but give ground if they ask you to move. It's pretty helpful, sometimes vital, to report with a partner. A lot of news organizations want a reporter out with a photographer or two reporters together. That's hard to do for small organizations, of course, but it really helps. One person can watch the other's back because you can't see what's going on behind you all the time. And if somebody's moving in from that side, it just gives you more eyes. And if somebody gets arrested, somebody else was there to see it and can help you out, which leads to that other important guideline that Jane mentioned is have your lawyer's number handy or an editor's number or both should you get arrested. understand, and Jane can correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not licensed to practice law anywhere, but you don't have to consent to a search. Doesn't mean they won't take your stuff. A lot of organizations suggest having a dummy memory card if police want to take your photos, and hopefully they take the one that doesn't have anything on it. And a lot of this is just common sense. You know, having a car fairly nearby so you can get away and get to the next spot you need to, but not so close by that you can't get to it or that it's going to get damaged, things like that. So those are a few, and there's a lot of tip sheets about that. There's also a lot of things that we have talked about what makes good reporting at a protest, but we can talk about that if somebody has questions about it.
Great, I see a lot of questions. I want to talk, give one question from Mark Lasson, who was a reporter for the West Central Tribune, asked, there's been some talk about the responsibility of journalists to not expose the identities of those protesting without consent, as they might expose those people to state or individual violence. What's your recommendation on how to square the responsibility of journalists to present truthful information to the public while not advancing potential violence against them?
You know, I think for me, and Chris can address this from his point of view, I think the question is what it always ought to be, which is what's the news value of this? Sometimes there is news value, sometimes there isn't. Again, from a purely legal perspective, if you're in a public place, you have no expectation of privacy. So of course the journalist can record your image and then broadcast it, publish it, put it online, whatever the case might be. But I guess, again, when I'm thinking in terms of people that might be vulnerable, for example, children, people like that, the question is, what's the value in doing this? And there may be a very good reason to do it, but I think it's a question that we should always ask. And with the rise of social media as a form of reporting, I think people aren't taking a moment to stop and think about that. They're capturing the image and they're putting it out immediately. And I get that because the immediacy of news is a really heady kind of thing, and we can get really addicted to it. But I think it is important to think about what the consequences would be. Having said that, though, I think that journalists definitely should not pull their punches if they think it's a legitimate news story. And, I'm a graduate of the Northwestern Medill School of Journalism, and some of you may remember that there was a major contretemps when the Daily Northwestern took down photographs that they had previously published when students protested that it violated their privacy or put them in harm's way. And it was very controversial. There were a lot of people who criticized them for doing that. There were others who said that that was the responsible thing to do. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk about it from an ethical perspective. But I think, again, my major point would be it's legal, but then you have to ask yourself, does this really serve a newsworthy purpose that serves the public interest?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think that's right. The same rules apply as with any story. Stopping to think about the news value is always, step number one. I do agree that social media pressures us to get stuff out there really quickly, and you sometimes have to resist that and stop and think, is this representative? Is it newsworthy? Does it, unfairly or unethically invade somebody's privacy somehow? It's very hard to do that in a public place, but the child example is a good one. I don't think there are a ton of exceptions, though, to if people are protesting, and we know reporters who are getting death threats for taking photos at these public protests. And the whole idea of a protest is to go out in public and be heard and be seen. And of course, the news media is going to capture that and report on it. And that's their job. That's presumably what the protest is for. It's in a public place. I think we have an obligation to report those things. And if there is, everybody has their self-interest, of course. Protesters don't want protesters seen doing unlawful things, but if they're doing those are very newsworthy, and police don't want journalists witnessing and taking photos of and video of them being rough on people, but that's very newsworthy. So these are times when I don't think there, from a journalist perspective, there are too many exceptions to the idea that this is going on in public. It's in the public interest. Anybody could go there and see it. Our job is to capture it for you and report on it, show it visually, and explain it in the best and fairest context possible.
Could I add just one thing really quickly? Because I was thinking about this the other day. Mayor de Blasio in New York, I understand, got very angry when it was revealed that his daughter had been protesting and had been arrested. And he said they violated her privacy by reporting the fact that she had been arrested. And, you know, this is one of these things that always has driven me crazy. Arrests are public information, and it's for a reason. And the reason is it helps to keep government accountable. If we don't know who the government arrests and detains and incarcerates, then how can we possibly be sure that they're doing this in a just and equitable fashion? So, you know, I guess that's why I'm not terribly sympathetic to the privacy argument in general, but I'm really not sympathetic to it in the context of arrests, because here in the Twin Cities, at the end of last week, we were being told by public safety and by the governor that there were outside agitator gangs that were coming in to pillage and destroy the Twin Cities. And that had been the official version. As it has turned out, relatively few of the people who were arrested were from outside of the state. So, you know, again, I'm not saying that the government was deliberately trying to mislead the public, but the facts did not bear out what their narrative had been. We would never know that if that arrest information were secret.
Thank you, Chris and Jane. We have a number of questions, and I'm going to try to get through them. The first one here that I'm seeing is from Michael Anderson. He says that it's good to see WCCO live coverage on CNN late last night. My question, how do you living in the Twin Cities assess outside national or international coverage of events in the Twin Cities by journalists who parachute in to cover the crisis? And I would note, I just want to, before you answer, a couple things. First, we do plan on having some panels next week on photojournalism, as well as community journalism, who will be covering some of these issues in more detail. So if these are questions and issues that you want to hear more about, please tune in, and more information will be posted on our website later this week. And then second, I would just observe that our Minneapolis media community is actually quite diverse, with a variety of immigrant populations and publications, as well as reporters who represent the community. And so one of the things that we are seeing here is that our local reporters are really getting those stories. And so I encourage everyone to tune in. Now back to the question. Chris and Jane, what do you think about the parachuting in phenomena?
You know, I wanted to just touch on that quickly. For all the criticism of journalism these days, I think the coverage has been pretty darn good, and it's hard. I mean, I have had to do, not on protest, but, you know, show up at another city and get a lay of the land and figure stuff out fast. And it is hard work. And I think a lot of these journalists who have done this, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but have done a great job. But I do think that when you're from out of town, it takes a lot more work, because you have to figure out where things are. You have to figure out how to get there fast and how to get out fast if you need to. You have all the other kind of practical considerations. You got to get a car, and you got to get there on time, and all that. And I don't expect them to understand. I mean, it helps if you're a reporter and you get put in that situation, you know, before you go, or when you're on the plane, you know, you got to do some background, especially on the public officials you think are going to be involved in this. It kind of helps to know. I had forgotten, but it kind of helps me to know that the head of public safety, John Harrington, was also the St. Paul police chief during the RNC National Convention when so many things went wrong and they were going to fix it. And a lot of things are going wrong now. It helps to know what the political makeup is. And you can do a lot of that by just doing a lot of homework as fast as you can. And it means it's more work. It means you don't necessarily aren't going to be able to get to the leadership quite as well because you've never talked to them before and they don't know who you are. But you can still talk to a lot of people. And I've seen some national media do a pretty nice job, I think, of getting people to talk to them and representing the community's voice. So I don't have a big issue with that. Hey, they should be covering it, and they are. So I don't have a big complaint about it.
Another question comes from Tyler Valeska. Jane, you discussed exemptions from the curfew orders as only exemptions that journalists get vis-a-vis the public in covering protests. Are there any exemptions you think they should be granted? For example, should credentialed press be guaranteed the ability to leave kettles like we've seen in DC?
This is such a complicated question. We could talk about it at length. I have a general aversion to laws that single out the press for special privileges. Minnesota, like most states, has a journalist shield law, for example, that protects reporters from being compelled to provide testimony in most cases. That's a good thing. I talked about the exemptions specifically here in the context of the curfew. But here's the problem with particular exemptions for the press: defining who's covered by them. This was maybe not a huge issue 15 or 20 years ago, but now when so many people say, I'm acting as a journalist because I'm gathering information and I'm reporting it to the world, there does raise the question of how do you decide who actually gets to utilize these protections. What I would rather see, rather than some kind of statutory regime in this kind of context, would be what I talked about at the very beginning of this webinar, which is for law enforcement, journalists, their representatives, and lawyers to all sit down and say, we need to get protocols in place that, for example, would say that if a journalist gets swept up in a kettling operation or some other operation, there should be some body that they can go to right then and there to say, yes, you really are a journalist, you shouldn't be here, we will release you instantly. Because again, one of the obvious problems with this, which I think is often not mentioned, is that when a reporter is arrested and taken away, you've basically lost that set of eyes and ears. They're gone. And there's nobody there to record what is happening. So it isn't just an issue of, oh, this poor reporter, he had to leave the scene, he had to cool his heels in jail for a while. It's that the public is being deprived of this information. So again, what I would rather see, rather than trying to come up with a whole bunch of statutory protections, is to come up with protocols where law enforcement is thoroughly grounded in the idea that the journalists have a right to be there, they have a job to do, and that it serves the public, just as law enforcement claims they're doing, serving the public. So we all have a common interest here. Let's sit down and figure out how to make that work.
We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Some of my colleagues were attacked by protesters last weekend. Activists have been telling me they see journalists as being an arm of the police. I've been having conversations about how to build trust with the activist community so we can accurately cover them. Then my publication ran the names and mugshots of people arrested during the protests, and local activist groups took that as journalists working in lockstep with the police. While I don't see it that way, I also don't really see what we gained by publishing those names with no context. My two questions are, how do I open a dialogue about this with my editors? And how do we listen and build trust with activists while maintaining journalistic integrity? Chris, can you try to answer this one?
Yeah, it's not easy though. It's not an easy answer, I don't think, but a lot of that work is done before this stuff ever starts, of course. And we know that many news organizations need more diversity on their staff, of course, and that's a pretty big, has been a pretty big issue across the country. A lot of news organizations don't do well at that, and they need to. A lot of the best journalism happens because people are present, you know, the old 75% of success is being there. And covering those communities over time before the bad stuff happens builds relationships. And news organizations trying to understand, editors too, trying to have dialogues and listening to what activist groups and diverse parts of your community are thinking about your coverage and about what kind of problems there are in the city or in the area is important. Again, most of that is done before, you know, difficult events come up. A lot of news organizations have guidelines or rules about publishing names of individuals who are arrested and not charged. So I think a lot of news organizations would not run the names, and certainly not the mugshots of people just because they're scooped up in an arrest during a protest. So I think that's an issue that should be addressed. Every news organization should know what their policy is on that and have talked through a policy on that, I think. So that can help a lot too. Any news editor should be interested in knowing the community better and knowing what people think. Doesn't mean they tell you how to report the news or anything like that. But we're in the business of gathering information and of having relationships with people so we can cover things better. That should be going on at every level of the newsroom process.
Thanks, Chris. Jane, did you have anything to add?
I just would like to pick up on one comment, which was this idea of journalists being perceived as an arm of the government. And this is the reason that journalists are so adamant that they have to have the protections, like in this state, our Free Flow of Information Act, which is our journalist shield law, that protects them from being compelled to provide information to the police. And I've heard people say, you know, from the very beginning, we were talking about journalists not having special rights. You know, you're citizens too. You know, you live in this community. Don't you care if these bad people are brought to justice and so forth? And, you know, none of us can pretend that we are not members of this community, that we don't live here, that we may feel threatened or our property may be endangered or our lives may be endangered. So we have a stake in this too. But I think the point is that the journalists have a special role to play. They really do. And that is to collect this information and to publish it and make it available to the public. And then the people and law enforcement can do with it what they will. But we can't be perceived as simply the agents of the government as we go forward, or we can't do our jobs. That's what the First Amendment's all about.
And that's the reason that in the past, when police have asked journalism organizations to provide their photos so that police can arrest people who are involved in violence, they say no. I mean, you can look at them in the paper or on TV like everybody else, but we're not giving you our unpublished stuff. And they will go to court to fight that. So there are a lot of examples of ways that news reporters try to make it clear that they are not arms of law enforcement. I mean, they're showing great pictures of violence by police officers. So that's more evidence that they try to take it very seriously.
I think that we have time for one more question. And Karen Schultz writes, I'm aware of a photographer who was stopped on the Ford Bridge post-curfew and showed his press credentials, but was refused passage across the bridge to his home. This has happened twice. How would you advise the reporter in a case he runs into this a third time? Any advice, Jane?
I can't give legal advice because I'm not licensed to practice in this state, but I mean, there seems to be a problem here, right? And so I would say before you're going to be out driving around after curfew, you need to get in touch with whichever branch of law enforcement is doing this. If it's, you know, St. Paul Police, it said it was on the Ford Parkway Bridge, so I'm going to guess it's St. Paul Police, but maybe not. But whoever it is, you need to get in touch with them and remind them that journalists' essential employees and subject to this exemption, and that they have every right to be there. Again, I would not recommend fighting with the police over this. You know, is this really something you want to be arrested for? You know, sure, you will be released, you will get off. But I think, as Chris and I talked about earlier, you know, prevention is 9/10 of the cure here. And since it's happened repeatedly, I would say it's time to go over these people's heads. You know, get their badge number. You know, find out who they are, and get in touch with their supervisors and say this has become a pattern in practice and it's not acceptable.
I'm looking at the time. I think we can answer this one last question I see from Hijin Han, which is, how does the ethics of journalism merge with the need to influence the dismantling of racism in society? We need powerful institutions to denounce journalism. Is the responsibility of journalists to make this message clear? I think we can possibly have a quick one answer to that.
What was the last part? Can you say the last part again?
Is the response, yes, is it the responsibility of journalists to make this message clear? I would answer that we teach in our school that's the responsibility of journalists to give voice to those messages when they come from those institutions, but journalists themselves usually are not going to be taking a particular position in their regular reporting unless it's on the pages of the opinion section. Chris?
Yeah, I know this is coming up, and it's coming up in newsrooms all over the place too, about what's our role in identifying racism, defining racism, and taking a stand against racism. And boy, those are very hard questions. I think we all stipulate to the idea that racism is bad, at least in the mainstream media. We all stipulate to that. Defining what is racism in an individual situation is very different and very difficult, and subject to a lot of different interpretations. And so I think what we can do best is be out there and show what is happening, talk to people in the community about how they see it and how they interpret it, and experts about how they see and interpret it, and give people as much information as we can so they can make their decisions about how they feel about it, and make calls to action. We had a lot of journalists, I know, feel strongly that they need to make a statement about some of these things because they're people too, and they are offended by what they see, and I get that. But I think the best thing journalists can do, we have great power already. We have tremendous power to tell these stories and let people, you know, more than me tweeting what was a racist act, I have a lot more power in covering that act, letting other people decide it, because I can influence thousands or millions by covering it. I can't, because I don't do it anymore. And it's always a good caveat. The people out there on the front line, the real journalists, are the ones who answer these questions best and will be in our upcoming webinars. But you know, journalists have a tremendous amount of power to cover the story and get that out to a lot of people. And the more they can show that they are impartial, that they're not in support of any special interest or anything like that, the more powerful that and more trusted that journalism is. And that's what makes change. And I believe that, and I think that's our primary role.
Thank you, Chris and Jane. Before we break away, I want to ask the audience a couple of poll questions. Sue will, our events coordinator, will help us here. First, we'd like to know if you would be interested in receiving notices about future events and the Silha Center's bulletin that highlights research in areas where legal and ethical issues converge, and reports on changes in law or in how journalistic practice might result. You can give you a chance to respond to this poll here before it closes. Thank you to those of you who are responding here. We're going to end this poll, and then we're going to ask one others in just a few seconds. There we go. Thank you. And then we want to know if you found this event to be helpful and some feedback on it. Thank you for your feedback and for joining us today. We will have several more events in the days ahead. On Friday, with the Public Relations Society of Minnesota chapter, we will be talking about the ethical responsibilities of public relations, the ethical role and responsibility of people who are engaged in press conferences. There's a lot of stories around that today. And then next week, we plan on having panels around topics related to community journalism, issues in photojournalism and ethics involved, and as well as the ethics and the challenges of broadcasting live protests and other events. Thank you all for your feedback and for joining today. I hope that you'll consider joining us on Friday and for future events. Watch the Hubbard School website and social media channels for future information. Thank you.